Before fast guitars, before screaming vocals, before metal fans started arguing online about what real metal actually is, there were 4 guys from Birmingham who didn't want to start a genre. They just wanted to sound heavier than everyone else. And somehow, they accidentally created heavy metal. This is Black Sabbath. But here's the part most people don't talk about. Black Sabbath wasn't supposed to exist at all. Let's stop for a second and imagine something. Imagine Black Sabbath actually failing. No records, no albums, no legacy. Tony goes back to factory work. Ozzy gets another random job he hates. And metal simply never happens. No Iron Maiden, no Metallica, no Slayer. Rock music stays loud, but never dangerous. That's how close this entire genre came to not existing. Because Black Sabbath had no master plan and no big label vision. Just 4 guys, broken fingers, cheap horror movies, and a sound that scared the hell out of everyone, including themselves. Chaos that changed rock music forever. So today, let's go back to the very beginning. To Birmingham, to factories, fear, and the moment metal was born. Late 1960s, Birmingham was not London. No colorful fashion scene, no psychedelic optimism. Just factories, smoke, steel, and a working-class reality where most people didn't dream about fame. They dreamed about surviving the week. As this city didn't inspire love songs. It inspired anxiety, frustration, and very loud noises. Which explains a lot. A typical day for Black Sabbath didn't look like rock stardom. They'd rehearse in cold rooms surrounded by noise from factories outside, sometimes louder than the band itself. Rather than chasing fame, they chased money for the rent. And when rehearsal ended, they didn't go to parties. They went back to jobs they hated. That frustration didn't disappear. It went straight into the music. Now let's talk about Tony Iommi. Because if heavy metal has an origin myth, this is it. Tony worked in a factory, but on his last day before quitting, he had an accident. He lost the tips of 2 fingers, and for a guitarist, that's not an inconvenience. That's a career-ending disaster. Doctors told him the same thing everyone else did. You'll never play properly again. But instead of quitting, Tony did something unexpected. He adapted. He made homemade fingertips out of plastic, used lighter guitar strings, and most importantly, he tuned his guitar down. Not for style, not for heaviness, but because it hurt less. And just like that, the sound of heavy metal was born, purely out of physical necessity. Without manifesto, without master plan, it was just pain management. Heavy metal wasn't invented in a studio. It was invented as a workaround. While other bands were singing about peace, love, and colorful dreams, Black Sabbath looked around and thought, yeah, that doesn't really match our reality. Geezer Butler started writing lyrics about war, religion, paranoia, and fear. Fun fact, Geezer was genuinely interested in occult literature, not in a cartoonish horror movie way, but intellectually. Which means Black Sabbath didn't pretend to be dark. They simply reflected the world they saw. And for many people, that was uncomfortable. Ozzy Osbourne wasn't a frontman in the classic sense. He didn't have perfect pitch, he didn't even have a formal training, and he definitely didn't look like a rock star. What he had was much rarer. A voice that sounded like it came from the same factories they worked in. Slightly unstable, slightly uncomfortable, and completely impossible to ignore. Ozzy didn't sing about fear. He sounded like fear. Which, coincidentally, made parents absolutely hate the band, which is usually a good sign. The name, Black Sabbath, didn't come from philosophy or dark poetry. It came from a cheap horror movie playing across the street from the rehearsal room. The band noticed something interesting. People were willingly paying money to be scared. So they asked a very simple question. Why isn't music doing the same thing? Therefore, instead of love songs, they wrote about nightmares. Instead of escapism, they amplified reality. And suddenly, The audience reaction changed completely. Some people were confused, some were terrified, some walked out. But the ones who stayed? They stayed for life. Here's something most people don't know. The unsettling sound that made Black Sabbath feel so sinister was based on something very old, the tritone, an interval so dissonant it was once called the devil's interval. In medieval times, this sound was literally avoided in church music because it felt disturbing. So naturally, Black Sabbath thought, perfect, let's use that. They weren't trying to be evil, they were just trying to be honest. And honesty, it turns out, doesn't always sound pleasant. Early Black Sabbath shows weren't a success. Critics didn't just dislike the band, they were offended by them. The music was too slow, too heavy, too dark, and worst of all, it wasn't even trying to be clever. In an era of peace, love, and optimism, Black Sabbath showed people exactly how ugly reality was. And that reality doesn't make good background music. Journalists laughed at them, and reviewers described their music as ugly noise and a complete blunder. Which was surprisingly accurate, because metal was a mistake, a beautiful but accidental mistake. And instead of fixing it, Black Sabbath turned it up. Now let's talk about the debut album. Black Sabbath recorded their first album in roughly 12 hours. Yes, hours. Not weeks, not months. The label didn't believe in it. Critics hated it. No one involved realized this album would change music forever. There wasn't even a name for this kind of sound yet. Heavy metal wasn't a genre. They just were heavier than everyone else. Their first album wasn't designed to be successful. It was recorded quickly, cheaply, and with zero expectations. Nobody thought this sound would last, including the band, which is funny because that album ended up sounding like a warning. Not entertainment, a warning. Here's the important part. Black Sabbath didn't invent every element of metal, but they created the space for it to exist. They proved that music could be slow and heavy, dark and serious, uncomfortable and still powerful. Without Black Sabbath, metal might still exist, but it would probably sound much more polite. Metallica, Slayer, doom metal, stoner rock, all of it traces back to 4 working-class musicians who didn't care about trends. They didn't follow the scene, they built their own world. And everyone else eventually followed. Black Sabbath matters because they proved something timeless. Music doesn't have to be pretty to be meaningful. It doesn't have to be fast to be heavy. And it doesn't have to be optimistic to be real. They didn't escape reality, they magnified it. And that's why their influence is still everywhere. Black Sabbath didn't just change music. They proved that mistakes can become movements, and that sometimes the sounds nobody wants to hear end up shaping everything that comes after. There are many more stories like this. Bands that weren't supposed to work, sounds that weren't supposed to last. And we'll be exploring them right here. Every Thursday on Toxic Pearl.